The clock on the wall of the transit hub pulsed with a steady, mechanical rhythm. 12 o'clock. Outside, the streets of New York were a chaotic symphony of motion. Yellow taxis gridlocked the avenues. People moved in a frantic blur, checking watches, clutching briefcases, and navigating the crush of the sidewalk. It was a Tuesday, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. The air held the familiar scent of exhaust and hot asphalt. High above the skyscrapers, the sky was a clear, piercing blue. A man stopped at a corner, looked up, and squinted. He checked his wrist. The second hand swept forward, meeting the 12. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the city held its breath. The traffic noise seemed to dampen, the wind stilled, and the relentless ticking of the world reached a sudden, absolute silence. Then, the blue horizon vanished. The light did not fade, it inverted. A white, blinding radiance erupted. The final second had expired. The light did not just shine, it consumed. Every surface in the city became a mirror, reflecting a brilliance that defied the sun. The air began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled teeth and shattered glass in windows miles away. This was not a sunrise. It was the sky itself turning into a furnace. Across the globe, the signal went out, and the silence of the void was replaced by the roar of 13,000 warheads waking at once. From the Arctic wastes to the southern deserts, the atmosphere ignited in a synchronized, blinding chain reaction. The horizon lost its definition, bleeding into a seamless wall of white heat. People on the ground looked up, their faces etched in the sudden, unnatural glow, realizing in that final, agonizing microsecond that the sky was no longer a canopy, but a weapon. The temperature climbed, stripping the oxygen from the air. The clouds evaporated, leaving only a scorched, glowing expanse. Every continent stood under the same searing canopy. The countdown had ended, and the fire had arrived. At the heart of the fire, the temperature surged to 100 million degrees. Matter could not sustain its form. In Tokyo, the steel skeletons of the financial district turned to liquid in a heartbeat. The skyscrapers did not collapse. They simply ceased to be solid. Glass curtain walls turned to vapor, and the heavy girders that anchored the city flowed like water down the streets. Across the globe, the same erasure unfolded. In London, the historic spires and modern glass towers were caught in the white-hot surge. The stone crumbled into dust, and the steel frames warped, twisted, and finally melted into a glowing, viscous pool. The heat was so absolute that the very air turned into a plasma, incinerating everything it touched before the shockwave could even begin its journey. Moscow followed, its massive structures dissolving into molten slag as the ground itself began to bubble. There was no time for structural failure. It was a total, instantaneous liquefaction of the industrial age. The architecture of human achievement was reduced to a featureless, burning sludge. Then came the physical force. The shockwave tore through the atmosphere, a wall of compressed air traveling faster than sound. It hit the suburbs with the weight of a mountain. Trees were not blown down, they were snapped at the roots and pulverized into splinters. The sound arrived a fraction of a second later. A roar so deep it vibrated the marrow in human bones, drowning out all other noise. Every structure within a 1,000-mile radius was flattened in a single continuous sweep. Concrete foundations were ripped from the earth. Steel beams, already softened by the heat, were twisted into jagged ribbons and thrown for miles. The atmosphere itself was torn open. The horizon, once a distant line, vanished. In its place rose a literal wall of fire, a towering, incandescent curtain. It consumed the sky, turning the blue expanse into a roiling orange hellscape. Nothing stood in its path. The fire did not just burn, it erased, pushing the boundary of the inferno further until the world was nothing but a wall of flame. As the firestorms reached their peak, the process of extinction entered a new phase. The heat began to subside, but the atmosphere remained in violent motion. Millions of tons of pulverized concrete, shredded steel, and incinerated organic matter were lifted by the thermal updrafts. This debris surged upward, punching through the troposphere and into the stratosphere. It did not scatter. Instead, it coalesced into a massive, churning front. The sky darkened as the material thickened, turning from a bruised purple to an opaque, suffocating gray. Within minutes, The sun was no longer a visible disk. It became a dim, dying ember behind the rising wall of soot. The shroud expanded, driven by high-altitude winds, wrapping the entire planet in a seamless, light-blocking blanket. It was a global eclipse, forged from the remains of civilization. The light of day was effectively extinguished, replaced by a permanent, heavy twilight. The shroud solidified, a dense, black ceiling that stretched from horizon to horizon, sealing the fate of the world in a cold, lightless tomb. The temperature drop was not gradual, it was a plunge. Within 48 hours, the mercury plummeted 20 degrees Celsius across every continent. The warmth that had sustained the planet for eons vanished, replaced by a biting, sharp cold that settled into the soil. In the vast agricultural plains of the Midwest and the expansive steppes of Eurasia, the effect was instantaneous. Crops that had been standing in the fields turned brittle under the sudden frost. The stalks did not wilt, they snapped, their cellular structures rupturing as the water inside them turned to ice. Within days, the green of the harvest was replaced by a uniform, gray layer of ash. The frost crept deeper, reaching into the earth and hardening the topsoil into a concrete-like crust. Rivers, once flowing arteries of the world, began to slow. The water grew thick and viscous, contaminated by the radioactive fallout that had drifted down from the soot-choked sky. The surface of the river stopped moving, turning into a sludge that refused to freeze solid, instead forming a toxic, semi-liquid mass. The landscape was no longer a living environment. It was a frozen chemical wasteland, locked in a permanent, sub-zero grip that silenced the movement of water and the growth of life. The survivors crawled from the wreckage of their homes into a world that no longer recognized them. The sky was a perpetual, bruised twilight, devoid of direction or time. There were no sirens, no broadcasts, and no signals of any kind. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of breath through makeshift filters. The air carried a distinct, sharp tang of metallic dust that coated the tongue and burned the back of the throat. It was the taste of the fallout. Within hours of exposure, the physical toll became impossible to ignore. Skin began to react to the poisoned environment, erupting in angry, weeping blisters. The body's internal systems started to fail. A slow, systemic breakdown triggered by the invisible radiation permeating the ruins. There was no medical aid to seek, no government to provide order, and no path back to the life they had known. They moved through the skeletal remains of cities, stepping over debris that had once been offices and homes. Every action required a calculated risk. They stood in the gray light, waiting for a change that would not come, trapped in the physical reality of their own disintegration. The surface offered only cold and radiation, so the remnants of humanity retreated into the earth. They huddled in the deep basements of collapsed towers and reinforced concrete bunkers, spaces designed for safety that had become permanent cells. The darkness inside was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of a dying battery. Here, the rules of the old world dissolved. A single tin of preserved food, pulled from a hidden pantry or a scavenged crate, held more weight than any bank vault. It was the difference between another day of life and the end. People bartered their remaining possessions for a handful of calories, trading heirlooms and tools for a chance to stave off hunger for a few more hours. They sat in tight, silent rows, listening to the muffled groan of the structures above. Every eye was fixed on the ceiling, waiting for a light that would not break through the thick, black shroud of the stratosphere for years. There was no movement, no plan, and no hope of rescue. They simply existed in the damp, freezing air, counting the ticks of a clock that no longer mattered. Outside the bunkers, the wind never stops. It tears through the hollowed-out skeletons of skyscrapers, creating a low, mournful whistle that echoes across the frozen plains. There are no birds to sing, no insects to hum, and no water to flow. The forests have been reduced to charcoal, and the oceans are choked with the debris of a billion lives. The planet has become a cold, silent monument to a choice made in a single, irreversible moment. Technology, once built to protect, became the architect of this total extinction. The embers of the firestorms have long since faded, leaving behind a world that is nothing more than a graveyard of industrial ambition. We look back at the ruins and see the cost of our own trajectory. The path we walk today is the same path that led to this final, darkened horizon. We stand on the precipice, watching the clock tick down toward a threshold we have not yet crossed. The sky is still blue. The air is still breathable. The machines of war remain dormant, waiting for a hand to turn the key. As the silence of this dead world presses in, the question remains: will we choose to turn back before the sky ignites,